Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Put together a nice panel here of some of the quote-unquote biggest names in security research space to talk about this whole notion of partial disclosure, full disclosure, what is disclosure, and just to get a handle on the debate. Just quickly, I'll let everyone give a quick 1-minute bio introduction of themselves, starting with Dan on the left.
Well, my name's Dan Kaminsky. I'm the director of penetration testing for IO Active. I've been doing talks at cons for about the last decade, and last year the whole DNS thing went down, and we ran 30 days where we told everyone that there was a big problem, gave them patches for it across a lot of platforms, didn't give them enough information to reproduce the flaw. So that's kind of my place in this whole game.
My name is Alex Soderov. I work as an independent security consultant right now. I think vulnerabilities are fun, and I will disagree with everything Dan says.
My name is
Alex, your hacking is awesome.
I'll be struggling to be heard amongst all of these guys for the entire 2 hours and 15 minutes. My name is Katie Masouras. I'm a senior security strategist with Microsoft. I've been doing security for a better part of a decade. I've been a researcher, a vendor, a coordinator of vulnerabilities. I've founded vulnerability research programs at Symantec and at Microsoft, and I've acted as the part of the vendor in receiving vulnerability reports in both open and closed source software.
My name is Dino Daizovi. I'm a security researcher also, and been a pen tester. I've done time at Stake, some financial services companies, and I also like finding bugs and writing exploits.
I'm Ivan Arce. I'm the CTO of Core Security Technologies, a company founded in '96. We've been doing penetration testing services and software products for penetration testing since then. I also participated since '96 in finding, reporting, and disclosure of over 100 security advisories. The first one of them being one on predictable query IDs on DNS in '97.
Ooh. Let's start with Yvonne. What is partial disclosure? Because there's the definition is all up in the air. So and we can probably go around and jump in and not wait for me to ask questions. But if you can start off with your definition of partial disclosure, does it even exist?
Well, I don't think that such a thing exists, and we talked about that before, so that's the answer you wanted.
No,
but it will be hard to put a definition on it. But I would say that it's providing information about the vulnerability either to a subset of the potential population that is affected by it or can do something about it, or a subset of the required information that is necessary to independently find, reproduce, and fix the problem. That's, I think that's the most accurate definition I can come up with.
So a fraction of the information.
A fraction of the information, or a fraction of, or to a fraction of the audience.
Cool.
So I don't think anyone argues too much about you find a vuln and you tell 20 or 30 customers, as long as the vendors are involved too. I don't think that's the sort of partial disclosure we're really talking about here. The model of partial disclosure that I think is the most controversial is where you tell lots of people, hey, there's a problem. Maybe you give them a patch to do, maybe you don't. Maybe you give them actions to take, maybe you don't. But you tell them there's a problem, and you don't give them enough proof to actually validate for themselves that that problem actually exists. You might give them evidence, look at all these other people who think there's a problem, but you don't actually give enough stuff for an engineer to validate the find. I think that's a fair definition.
Dan, what went into your thinking? Just give me your mindset in the DNS issue to go the partial disclosure route. In your mind, it was absolutely necessary at the time, originally. Subsequently, said you wouldn't do it again. Give us a sense of what went into your thinking to go that route.
Well, there are three things that it takes to take a bug from. There are three things you have to do to protect people from a vulnerability. First, you got to find the bug. You actually have to identify that something is wrong in the system. But that's not enough, so you found something. There has to be a fix. So the second thing that comes to mind is, okay, well, let's go ahead and work with Paul Vixie and get all the potential vendors involved in a room, get us all to agree, yeah, let's get a fix out. Let's even get the fix out on the same day. But there's a third thing that's required. Like, vendors are great and powerful, but they don't deploy the fixes. The people who deploy the fixes are the actual corporate IT administrators and ISP administrators who actually need to take that code and put it into a position where it can prevent my mom from being attacked. I can do all the magic in the world to generate a fix. Someone's got to actually get that code out. And I'd spent a bunch of time in corporate environments. I spent my entire career there. And I'm like, there's no way, even if people wanted to, even if the CEO insisted that this patch, because of where it was, could be deployed instantaneously. So I'm like, all right, I'll make you guys a deal, talking to the vendors. You guys get your patch out on the same day, and I will do what I can so that IT staff actually has at least some chance of doing the due diligence to find out where their servers were, because they didn't even know, to figure out when they could deploy the patch and get it into a place that it would protect customers. I knew that couldn't be instantaneous, and that's really what drove a lot of my actions.
So Dan, you've admitted that part of the problem is that this infrastructure cannot be patched quickly enough, and that processes were not in place to allow this to happen. And yet, your actions actually contributed to the problem, because when you had an opportunity to teach people that this is important stuff that they need to take care of if this kind of bug happens ever again, instead, you gave them leeway. You allowed them to go without patching for, 13 days? Actually, the initial period was more like 30 days. So with this, it's like having a kid who's misbehaving, and instead of telling the kid, do not do this again, perhaps punishing the kid in somehow, instead, you're just letting the kid do whatever it wants. And as a result, the kid and also these corporate administrators learned that, well, when Dan finds a bug, we'll always have enough time, so we won't really have to think about how to do patches more quickly.
You know, I guess what it comes down to is I wasn't trying to teach corporate IT a lesson. I wasn't trying to beat them with the security stick. There was a problem, and frankly, most of the people that I spoke to were like, yeah, this DNS stuff actually really matters. We have to go fix it. We don't have the processes in place right now. We had, even with our best emergency processes, 30 days is a stretch. Like, yeah, it's better than 0, right? They're like, oh God, yes. And I mean, I think that's the real thing. Like, 30 days was hard. As an industry, as an IT community, we need to be able to patch our infrastructure with the sort of rapidity that we're able to patch our endpoints. But, you know, you have to walk before you run. You have to recognize that if you're very weak at doing something, it's going to take some time to learn that process. And to the extent that I, as a bug finder, can assist people in creating non-crisis mode processes to deal with their infrastructure, I think that's a good thing.
A big part of it was, you know, a big part of this is trust. Trust that Dan knows DNS. And what Dan is saying is accurate, and there was no peer review. Well, there was an attempt at peer review, which is where Dino came in. I mean, Dan briefed you ahead of telling everyone else so that you could validate or attempt to validate or help validate what he had found. Are you pleased with your role in how that whole thing went down?
Yes, so I was, and I was actually, you know, because I was very curious about the details of the vulnerability, so I was actually very honored that Dan, one, trusted me enough to keep the information private and, you know, let me in on it so I could, you know, help to say, okay, this is actually a big deal. But one of the things I found is, you know, at the time I was director of security at a hedge fund, and, you know, I found in the real world, a lot of people, like, in security are just kind of preaching to the choir. And so we were just convincing more security people, and they are each in their own organization still trying to fight the same fight of convincing the infrastructure people that this is a big deal. And, you know, I still had to, you know, argue tooth and nail for us to get our servers patched. And like in a time frame less than 2 months. And I was like, no, this is a big deal. And they're like, why? And I'm like, I can't tell you. And so basically,
Which is the problem.
which is a problem. And because, while we had, some people who were technically savvy enough, they could say, they had other people who kind of knew some details and they hinted at them. And like, once they got the hint from like 6 different people who they considered in the know, then they're like, okay, I think this might be serious, even though I don't have the details. But it's a huge leap of faith for a lot of these infrastructure people to do this, because if it goes wrong, I mean, you have to look at the risk from the risk calculation on their side. There's a unspecified vulnerability that has mostly specified consequences, and that they should patch, but there's no clear and present danger. However, if that patch changes anything and breaks something, and most infrastructure is way more fragile than we'd like to believe, that just changing the patch and changing the source port randomization, and then all of a sudden firewalls started breaking and basically getting overloaded and things just start tweaking out, that breaks something now. That's 100% certainty. And so they were unable to do that proper risk calculation of them getting fired for breaking something without enough information about what the real danger was and seeing actual clear and present danger.
But when a weaponized exploit made it into Metasploit, people were pretty clear that this was something serious. And in many respects, pain does help.
Yeah.
Ivan, what is the value of exploits in scenarios like this?
I think that I don't think of exploits as a tool to teach people a lesson and to force them to fix things. I think that exploits are a valuable tool, like many other tools, to actually protect things and figure out if your fixes are working properly. So in this case, having the Metasploit exploit actually helped a lot of people to verify that their servers were, and not only the Metasploit exploit, but also Dan's website that actually checked the query IDs of the DNS and DNS queries, to verify that the fix was actually working. And I want to go back to one of the things that Dino said, which is that there wasn't sufficient information to determine if the patch should or should not be applied, because the patch itself had side effects. In fact, installing a patch that randomizes source ports for the DNS makes DNS punch holes in your firewall on every query, and it opens up the firewall for attacks, particularly in UDP, as DNS is, for attacks that spoof packets that go back. So in our case, and I think that in many other cases, deploying the patch was also a risk, and lacking sufficient information to understand what the problem is and why that's the best patch strategy, people were left in the dark. And I think that there's a lot of people that didn't deploy the fix rapidly because of that.
So I think it's reasonable to consider there being 2 different populations of administrators out there. There's the population of administrators that's not going to deploy anything unless things are blowing up, or at least they see an exploit in Metasploit. And there's a population of administrators who, well, they know me, or they listen to their vendor, or they watch actually every single vendor in the field do the same thing in the same time, or they listen to the United States government. Basically, there's a pretty serious population of people who are like, wow, the entire industry seems to be aligning to go ahead and deploy this patch. Let's deploy it. That second category is kind of something to encourage. It would be nice if we didn't have to go ahead and generate exploits for every single thing. If it could simply be, there's a vulnerability, there's a reasonable path to removing the vulnerability, go patch. At the nth degree, not every bug should need to become a worm before we patch it. Simply knowing about the bug and having enough proof of that existence should be sufficient. So I completely agree that there were...
You agree that currently it is not.
It is absolutely the case that a large percentage of the people who ended up patching could not patch, even if they wanted to, within 24 hours. A large number of people did patch in the 13 days before the exploit came out, and most of the people who ended up actually patching at the end, the data suggests most of them took about 30 days.
How would you estimate the number of people who did not want to patch?
So we know that we did have a spike around when Metasploit actually came out. We had a total spike in people who were like, oh, okay, this thing is actually weaponized in the field, let's go ahead and patch. Totally true, totally legitimate. I wish they had patched earlier. But you know, there were a bunch of people who did what we would have wanted them to do, who saw their vendor, who saw the industry saying, yes, this is something to deploy. And they did it. And I think that those people who are willing and able to take the advice of the entire industry, I think that's a great thing.
So are we all up here with the same goal of trying to make this process go smoother next time, go better next time, protect more people next time? Is that,
Is that possible?
Is that a fair assumption on the part of you?
Yeah.
But Alex,
I
you believe that pain is good.
Well, all right, so I do use the internet, and my mom uses the internet, just like Dan's mom. And my kids someday will use the internet, and I would like
tweet a
them
lot,
to be
okay.
safer on the internet than we are now. I also agree that causing some damage in the short term is better than having insecure systems in the long term. So perhaps my risk-benefit analysis is slightly different from Katie's or Dan's.
Can you define
So-
damage?
Hmm?
Just define damage for me. Causing a little bit of damage. How do you define that?
Well, all right, I think the best example for this are the Microsoft worms that we had back around 2003. If you look at them in retrospect, even though they were pretty damaging, they did not actually have any serious payload. If these types of attacks have happened today, we would see a lot more code that steals credit cards, bank accounts, World of Warcraft accounts, installs botnets. So I think the fact that these attacks happened back then when they weren't as damaging because the sort of criminal underground wasn't as well developed as it is now, I think they served as a wake-up call and actually helped Microsoft and some other vendors take these things more seriously and make sure that these worms are much harder to do now than they were back in 2003, which is certainly true. I think we'll all agree with that. So I think that having some kind of pain in the short term, for example, breaking DNS now when not as many things rely on it as possibly would in 5 years. I think this is better than doing nothing about it and having the same vulnerabilities discovered 5 years from now and actually exploited for financial gain rather than just for fun.
So
So you're talking about two different, two different populations, really. So you're talking about vendors, my company included, and needing that wake-up call to be able to write more secure software. But you're also talking about infrastructure, so the deployers of this software. And the way that these two populations react to security threats is by necessity kind of different. So it may have taken a lot of, sort of serious wake-up calls for the general vendor population to start instituting, programs such as the SDL to write more secure software over time. But in an infrastructure, live deployment scenario, it's not as simple to be able to build these resilient systems that you're asking for to spring up, overnight at this point, because
Was it simple for a large vendor to do that?
it's been an iterative process. But if you're looking at in deployment systems right now, that critical infrastructure, that network of systems, you're looking at a much different problem than you're looking at a vendor overhauling its software development practices.
Well, I think the problems are similar. In both cases, you have some kind of organization that has some kind of established processes that don't seem to be doing a very good job at remedying vulnerabilities, preventing vulnerabilities, or reacting to vulnerabilities. And I do think that vendors have improved in that respect. I think that infrastructure has probably improved a little bit too, but we do need to see a lot more improvement. So I'm not sure why the thing that worked with the vendors would not work with the infrastructure people as well.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, you mentioned short-term gain for expected long-term gain in 15 years of short-term gain. What do you consider short-term
The question is, what is short term and what is the cap on pain?
42.
Well, I'm not really the industry, so I find it kind of hard to really answer that question. But it will. There's certainly a certain threshold, and that once you reach it, doing something about the problem becomes more cost-effective than not doing something. So once we reach that, I think the problem will go away.
Well, if you just look at history, you kind of have an example. Well, how much pain did it take for Microsoft to start taking security seriously? We now know the answer. How much pain does it take for industry to start taking like infrastructure security seriously? We don't know yet. So we got to keep amplifying a little bit. And one of the things I also want to point out from Dan's earlier discussion is we keep talking about the Metasploit exploit as being a weaponized. I think it's because we love saying the word weaponized. I mean, it's just so damn sexy.
Awesome.
But it wasn't. And actually, Dan you pointed this out in your presentation. There's a lot of limitation that you said the Metasploit exploit doesn't work in the field.
Well, no, the Metasploit host module doesn't work in the field.
No,
the domain module works just fine.
You said the bailiwicked one was not work one.
No. Bailiwicked host, we're geeking out. One of the modules doesn't work that well. The other one works fantastically.
Okay.
You just got to wait a little while. You asked the question about what is the appropriate amount of short-term pain, and I think that is a inconvenient framing for the problem. A better thing to say is, look, there are problems out there, and we know if we don't even look for them, if we put our head in the sand, that those problems are going to sit there forever, and the pain when the bad guys use them is just going to get higher and higher. I don't agree that there should be, a maximum amount of pain for people because they didn't do what security told them to do. That's just not my mindset. We should have research, we should find out what's wrong with our networks, but we should really optimize for how do we fix the problem? How do we make it smooth and easy? As a security industry, we've just not made it very easy to build good, secure systems. That's not other companies' problems. That's not developers' problems. To a very serious degree, that's our problem. It's too difficult and too expensive to take our advice. When we developed the patch and we got the synchronized patch out, that was not an easy thing to do, but we did it, and we got that done because we looked at the problem. We said, from the patch developer standpoint, we can at least get our patches out on the same day, so that the people running Microsoft code aren't, laughing at the people running Bind, or the people running Bind aren't laughing at the people running, Cisco. Let's get everyone out on the same day because that will make deployment easier. And you know what? The details of this are going to leak. There's no question. I don't know how many days we can get, but we can get some number of days. And whatever number of days, that's going to be another network and another network and another network that's safe. So we can help there too. I think that's a good thing. I think it is a great thing to, as much as possible, reward people who can, to the degree that is feasible in infrastructure, apply patches. I certainly don't think that we'd end up with a more secure internet if there was a DNS worm 2 days later.
So
I just don't think that.
So I wanted to point out something that you said earlier, to which I don't agree, and I think that at the root of that thought, it's many of the problems that we face with the partial disclosure topic. You categorize admins in two groups, either those that are driven by fear and they only react when the house is on fire, or those that are driven by recommendations from the security industry or from somebody, the government, an expert, somebody. I would like to think that there's at least a third category, and I'm not thinking that it's the only other one, but at least a third category, which is those admins and that people that would like to manage the risk in a rational manner, using rational analysis and not just fear or recommendations from some guy.
I think that's
those
reasonable.
guys, you need to give them the tools. If you want to help them, you need to give them the tools to let them make rational decisions.
I agree.
Marcus' question.
And the quality of tools is driven by information. The quality of tools
Exactly.
is driven by the quality or quantity of information given.
Exactly.
So how
Not,
do you?
not necessarily.
Go
I
ahead.
wouldn't say that it's driven by the level of information disclosure. I think it's mostly delivered via trust, because that was a big part of what made your partial disclosure of the DNS vulnerability effective in the ways that it was. And it's partly driven in, I think, perhaps the need to establish a more common language. So I'm guessing that you've probably never been in charge of a large infrastructure deployment.
No.
Right. So, and a lot of large infrastructure deployers have never been security researchers. So there needs to be some sort of common language and, just a lingua franca of being able to appropriately define the threat level in terms of, and then appropriately, act upon it. So if it's agreed and there's a trust there between the two parties, between the reporting party and the infrastructure deployment party, then I think in the long run, even if we're in a position where infrastructure has gotten about as resilient as the most resilient software company in the world for security, even if it has gotten to that point, there are still going to be security incidents to respond to in the future. There will be no perfect infrastructure in the future that is never going to need this kind of reporting and rapport back and forth between the security research community and the infrastructure that deploys the software that may be vulnerable.
Right, but trust me isn't a rational way of managing risk at all. I mean, is that a rational way of managing risk in an environment?
I think it is completely rational when your vendor says you need to deploy this patch. They're the people who you trust to have not put a rootkit into that server they shipped to you in the first place. So you're going to trust people.
Which has
There's
never
no
happened,
question of that.
right? Vendor shipping rootkits have never happened,
never.
ever. Right.
I do want to actually say something really quickly, because I think you hit on an important part. At least a portion of the people, and probably a significant portion of the people who patched once they saw Metasploit. You're absolutely right. They weren't responding to fear. Some were, but
Well,
I think a
it's
lot
not necessarily
weren't.
fear, though. It's information.
Exactly.
It's not real fear. I mean, if I have a Metasploit exploit that's showing me in a rational way in my environment that
Agreed.
I'm at risk, that's real information. That's not fear.
I agree.
Fear is saying you're at risk. I'm not telling you why, but trust me.
So what I'm saying is I certainly think that there is a substantial portion of administrators that if they're going to go ahead and take the risk to patch their environment, they want to see the vulnerability. But, there's also a lot of administrators who can run faster than the bear, or who need some extra time, or who just want to be able to say, well, look, my vendor says it's a really bad problem, and I don't need to know the actual vulnerability. I'm going to trust my vendor like I trusted my vendor not to ship me a rootkit in the first place. And for those customers, for those IT administrators, I can make their life easier.
Right, so those are the ones that you cater.
The ones
Cool.
who patched it before they saw the exploit had more time, more warning, more reliability, less need for crisis patch application. And to the degree that I can help those guys and make it so they're not there at 3 in the morning with, stale pizza, cool.
So you are trying to help those guys that make their decisions based on trust, not those that make their decisions based on a rational analysis of your finding. I think that's
I'm
okay.
trying to help the people
That's
who
great.
realize in order to
But
do
you
a
cannot
secure...
call that research.
Let me, you're right, this is bigger than just security research. This is how we actually get stable patches into the field. You want to talk rationality? Deploying an emergency patch across all the name servers in your infrastructure, which you don't even know where they are, and you've never actually had time to test it because you've waited all of those days, you are likely to cause the network to go down, and then you're likely to lose your job. So
Exactly.
I'd like people not to go down the path of, oh, I finally see the exploit. Wow, this is really bad. Let me deploy an emergency fix and get fired. And instead, have 30 days to say, okay, there's a problem. We don't necessarily know what it's a patch for, but we know it's for something really bad. Let's run the patch into testing, see that the patch is reasonable, try it on a few machines, and actually get something that's not this chaos, emergency, oh my God, deployment, but something that is well tested.
There's some-
That to me is rational.
Martin.
You're missing a major point here. This is not about trust, about me as a security person trusting Microsoft or you or Sun or anyone else. It's about the executives at my company empowering
Right.
And IT security people cannot go to their executives and get permission to push it out
With real information.
in a reasonable time frame. It doesn't matter how much we trust each other or don't trust each other, if our executives don't trust us to do our jobs properly. And it's an important part of this discussion that is being missed.
And monetary losses are the main thing executives care about. So more monetary losses,
Pain is
more,
good.
the more they're going to trust their security people.
Yeah, and also the DNS bug, we should try not to talk too much about this because
Right,
it
because
is
there are
somewhat
issues. There are other partial
there
disclosure.
are other partial disclosure issues, and it is somewhat of a special case because basically this was something like kind of the first time that a lot of people had to really patch their DNS servers in a long time. I mean, there's kind of a lot of this was like a really big thing, and what happens with like IT administrators is as they've gone through the process of things patching and things not exploding, they begin to trust it more. And so like for now we don't need to see an exploit for every single like Microsoft vulnerability to make sure it's real. Most organizations just say, we're used to this cycle. We patch either monthly, quarterly, or semi-annually, whatever our policy is, and that's we know our risk and we accept it. And if there's a extreme case, we'll break it. But infrastructure vulnerabilities often require more work than just flashing a patch across a ton of machines. It requires maybe sometimes moving machines across the network, and they also doesn't happen all that often.
And it's much more than Microsoft in the network too. I mean,
yeah, exactly. You have a whole lot of interoperability problems that potential things breaking with these kind of infrastructure patches. So I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people were slow to deploy is because there was a huge downside risk to this of things exploding.
So I wanted to get back to something that Katie mentioned, and I wanted her to elaborate on it a little bit more. I think you said that there was a difference between vendors and the way they would react to these vulnerabilities and get their patching processes in order, and the infrastructure people when reacting to vulnerabilities as well. And now I do recognize that patching infrastructure is potentially more disruptive and more risky than just patching a normal server. But if you compare the work that a vendor has to do to produce the patch, in terms of understanding the problem, QAing the patch, making sure it doesn't cause interoperability problems, and I'm sure that Microsoft has to deal with a lot of that when they make their patches. Isn't that pretty much the same thing that infrastructure people have to do when they need to patch a vulnerability as well?
Alex, there's however many couple dozen versions of Windows that need to get patched by Microsoft every time they put out something. Cisco supports over 15,000 independent versions of iOS. 15,000. It's a totally different universe of pain to deal with infrastructure than to deal with desktops. And that doesn't mean that infrastructure shouldn't get fixed. It does mean we have to recognize that it's an order of magnitude difference. Like 15,000 versions. This is not a problem that Microsoft has.
Well, and also, you're kind of talking about infrastructure at the macro level of sort of critical infrastructure, backbone type infrastructure. There's also the infrastructure that David Mortman was just talking about, which is in terms of the micro infrastructure of each individual organization that has to deploy these updates. So what, in terms of getting each individual organization empowered, to be able to deploy these things in a reasonable time frame is a much different argument. If we as security people kind of, go by the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability as all being, sort of equally important, roughly so, we're missing the part that the people who are responsible for keeping infrastructure going really only care about A. They only care about availability in a lot of cases. And that's the case where, they're really balancing the C and the I are sort of, lowercase to them as opposed to the capital A. And that's maybe some place where the way that we speak to them, we need to perhaps translate the effect of security vulnerabilities on their A.
But you also have to keep in mind, comparing Microsoft and Cisco is two different things. Okay, there are 15,000, 20,000 iOS versions out there, we know it, right? But they don't have to care about third-party drivers. They own the hardware, so the type of testing they have to do versus what Microsoft needs to do for QA is not the same. If you screw up a patch, you can, shut down the third party, run the APIs and stuff like that.
But so what I was asking Katie about was not actually Cisco as a vendor, having to build a patch for 15,000 devices. I was talking about an organization that has some Cisco products and they need to patch them. That organization is not going to have 15,000 different Cisco routers.
So the other thing to realize is patch management. I mean, we've been dealing with desktop vulnerabilities for much, much longer. Infrastructure vulnerabilities really cropped up last year. We had 4 major ones. Mine, the SNMPv3 bug, the BGP stuff, which still has no fix in sight, and the WPA1 attacks. Our framework for dealing with infrastructure is so much less mature than our framework for dealing with desktops. And like Katie's saying, I think we need to be able to communicate respectfully to just how much less resources organizations have for dealing with their infrastructure.
So
And
one thing is to communicate respectfully, and a different thing is to make decisions for them. And regarding your point on the 15,000 iOS versions, does that mean that the risk is diversified in 15,000 rather than a handful of operating systems?
Did you see FX's talk at CCC?
Yeah.
So FX went ahead and said there might be 15,000 versions
And
here.
they're all equal, right?
know.
They all weight the same, they all have the same value, they all have the same risk.
Well, no, they're all just as hard to fix because of testing, but they have a unique chunk in them that can be jumped to for exploitation. So you have this great situation where, no, it's still 15,000 versions of pain on the defensive side, but from the offensive side, you can take this little bootloader chunk and exploit them all at once. I mean, that was the big takeaway from FX's talk, that no, you can't consider yourself more secure just because of all these different versions. They're all iOS, they all have something in common. I mean, it was a tremendous talk.
There's one big difference. I mean, I'm running a backbone with 120,000 boxes on it, right? And there's one time in my life where we had to go full upgrade. That was the Cisco IP for Wedgeburg, which was a remote email of self-condition and reboot or kill the box of the host, right? In all the other cases, the workarounds using the workaround in configuration will actually save your ass, you know? And we're still running in our backbone, I think, 100,000 of the 120,000 are running all days in iOS. But the configuration, and the workarounds actually save you, because there's no way we can, even as service provider, from a patch management point of view, upgrade 120,000 browsers, twice a year. We upgrade the backbone twice a year. That's in the normal cycle. But that's all you can do, and that's limited to maybe 700-800 boxes. But doing more than that, I mean, we need an army of monkeys.
Well, I'm sure this is exactly what people said about patching 100,000 endpoints back in the day, but now patching 100,000 endpoints is certainly possible, and people do it. And this happened because there were enough vulnerabilities and enough exploits released to make it important. So I think I would like to ask my
disagree on that.
co-panelists.
Or just a
if-
lack of options. Or just a lack of options.
All right, so
Yeah.
so what happens in your scenario where the infrastructure to be updated is embedded systems driving around in people's cars? Is there a massive automotive industry recall while chips are ripped out of thousands of cars? I mean, this is the type of issue that it can be that difficult. It can actually be that difficult.
I realize that it is difficult now, but if you're a car company and you're building these types of systems, you have to recognize that in another 10 years
Okay.
or 20 years, you're going to have to patch them every single day.
Okay, what if they're
because you're going to
pacemakers
have 0 days.
and thousands of surgeries need to be performed?
Go on.
Well, then you need a different update mechanism than a surgery.
The car companies seem to be having some other economic difficulties. No, this is a very serious point. How much should they be investing
Yeah.
today to build an update mechanism into their systems so that they can achieve your goal? In answer to this question, I actually had to have my car upgraded a while back because of a software bug, and it looked like calling Cisco for a bug. I mean, I brought the car in, and it said was running wrong version XYZ, upgraded to XYZ.Q, per knowledge base article 321-5. And so they went in, they updated the ROM in my car, and handed it back to me 20 minutes later.
All right, so software is becoming more and more pervasive. We didn't have to worry about patching cars. No, like, in the 80s, you didn't have to worry about having your car patched. But today, you're starting to see this, and in the future, it's just going to accelerate more and more. So we are going to have to patch all these systems, cars, pacemakers, internet-enabled glasses.
So
We are going to have to patch them eventually. So I would like these vendors and these companies to start working on this now before it becomes critical. Because my prediction is, now I would prefer this not to happen because I would like to live in a safer world, but my prediction is that the car companies and the pacemaker companies and medical devices companies, all these other organizations are just not going to care about it until it's 2020 and people are getting their pacemakers DDoSed remotely. And then they're going to realize that, oh shit, we actually should have built something better back in 2009.
So I agree. Yoshikota's work is very interesting from this perspective, but how much should we be spending in today's economic environment? What percentage of the car development budget should go into update mechanisms?
I think,
Probably, go ahead.
I think I really don't understand what's this. I think everybody is overly fixated on patches, as if patching is were the only way to fix a security problem. And I think that fixation on patches is based on the fact that people would like to have the risk go away, disappear, the bug disappear. And many people, it's uncomfortable living with imperfect things like software. So the moment we start thinking that software is imperfect and we will have to live with bugs, we will think about solving security problems with other means, not just patches. Patches are good, patches are great, but there's other means to solve things. Mitigation of risk can come in many flavors. And going back to the partial disclosure debate, because that was the topic,
please.
right? And
cars.
I really like the analogies of millions of different things, like people trying windows and door knobs to trigger burglar alarms and port scanning and so on. But the topic was partial disclosure. So if we accept that mitigation is a valid strategy, then we need to open up our information to other potential, let's say, helpers, not just the vendor, but other people, other practitioners that may solve a problem to reduce risk rather than just the official one.
I just wanted to add a quick point to counter your economic argument about how much do the car companies pay for a secure update mechanism. A mere fraction of anything else they pay money for. How many security engineers does it take to design a secure update mechanism, and how much does that cost compared to the cost of one flight on a private jet? That is nowhere near the scope of their problems. It's chump change.
It's
But the first time they get a big
funny you
recall
mention
as
that
well.
actually, because so my girlfriend runs a web design firm, and she basically said, I'd love to go ahead and ship secure websites, but I kind of looked into it, and security professionals want more money to find out if the site was secure than I got for actually building the site in the first place. I mean, we're talking a greater than 100% increase. So don't think security is not cheap. It actually does cost money. It can cost a substantial amount of money.
It depends on the actual product and the scope of things. I mean, we're getting on to talk about
I did want to say, I mean, it's interesting we're talking about pacemakers and car crashes. You went in and got your car patched. I bet you didn't say, I want to see video of a car blowing up in flames. If there's a pacemaker that needs to get patched, it's like, I ain't letting you touch my pacemaker unless you kill that guy right there with your
Exactly, and the determination of how much pain is enough pain, that's not something that I think, should really reside in the hands of a single researcher with,
Yeah.
I think so.
A nuclear weaponized vulnerability, right?
The fact is, it took people dying in cars to make auto manufacturers do recalls before what's happening.
And recalls cost a lot of money, which goes back to Adam's point. They'll start investing in update mechanisms when it starts to hurt the bottom line, which comes back to Alex saying pain is good and information.
Nothing hurts sales like people dying in cars.
So I was not arguing that security researchers are the ones who said the level of pain and how much pain is enough. What I was saying is that, like, the market ultimately determines these things. I guess market and regulation, but we don't really have security regulation, so it is left to the market. So when the cost of not doing things, not taking care of security is greater than the losses of that arise from these vulnerabilities, then the vendors and infrastructure people and all these other people who need to take action are going to take that action. So I believe that as security researchers, our job right now should be to increase this cost in the short term to get these things fixed before they start being before these systems start being used in more critical ways.
Well, to some degree, we are the less expensive option, right? I mean, I would much rather an exploit be found by you than be found by some kid in Romania. I mean, that's the bottom line truth. Like, security research is truly all about, let's take something that would be really painful and expensive, a bug being found in the field and exploited. Adobe's spending a ton of money right now dealing with the PDF bug. You know, let's take that and instead let's have a more well-ordered, planned execution of a fix. I mean, that's what security research is about. It's about, we're not some kids in Romania dropping exploits and causing Adobe to spend a bunch of money. We are still finding the problems, we're still identifying them, we're still disclosing them, but we're doing it in a way that is as painless as possible while still achieving the goals of creating a secure infrastructure.
So here's a hypothetical, or an alternate history, if you will. So in 1988, the Morris worm appeared, and it showed that, yes, you can exploit buffer overflows, you can take over the entire internet with a worm. Like, conceptually, it was not any different from the worms that we had in 2003. The only differences were in implementation and also the size of the internet, the number of affected machines.
It was a little bigger.
A little bigger, yes. So I think that the reason we had to deal with this problem in 2003 was because nobody paid attention to it in 1988. And this was probably because there wasn't too much security research in buffer overflows in writing exploits. We didn't really see another public buffer overflow exploit until, what is it, 92? 5? No, the Thomas Lopatic exploit, I think.
There was enough research on buffer overflows. It was just not public. It was in the multi-security evaluation of 1974. That was a U.S. force document.
Right,
it wasn't public, but there was enough.
There was a lull in the that's LUL, the availability of exploits and the damage caused by buffer overflow exploits between 88 and, I guess, late 90s. And I think this was time lost. If security researchers had been producing exploits in 89, 90, 91, 92, and these problems, like, we would have gotten these problems out of our system by the mid to late 90s instead of having to deal with them in 2003 and afterwards.
Which is good that we got them out of our system in 2006.
Right.
Well,
Except on Mac.
it's not-
on the
What you're talking about, which is that we don't learn from history. We forget.
yes, because it's
The 88 worm is still being learned.
well, because the 88 worm. All right. So the comment was, we don't learn from history, and I do agree that we don't learn from history very well. I mean, human beings never do, but
But we do. I mean,
What we
the
do-
worm era is largely over. Because of 2003, the era of the worm is more or less dead.
yeah, but
Except-
that's
except
not
for-
really
well-
that's not really history. The Morris worm was history. We learn from
2003 was right.
pervasive attacks that cause a lot of problems, and when you see them every couple of months, like we did with the worms in 2003. I think the reason the Morris worm was sort of forgotten is because it wasn't repeated. Like,
I'm
nothing
really
happened.
glad
that
because the economic impact of it was fairly limited, because the economic size of the entire internet was pretty minimal in 88.
Yes, but if
2003.
if it was followed by worms, every couple of months throughout the early 90s, I'm pretty sure that all of these companies that enthusiastically embraced the internet in the 90s would have had second thoughts and would have demanded something more secure with a somehow better architecture. I don't know what the better architecture would
even
be.
with
What
the
people,
summer of worms.
people demand infrastructure that works. That stays up, that is available. I cannot emphasize enough how much availability actually matters in the real world. The 88 thing, you're absolutely right. It was not followed up with a sequence of, worms every couple of months. And so it did get forgotten. 2003 happened. Operating systems are way more secure. But, the worms of 2003, what did we have in the infrastructure realm? We had Michelin in 2005.
We talk about worms like they're ancient history, and it's like, okay, the Morris worm was a hybrid worm that did a buffer overflow and cracked passwords. We have not seen one of those in, I don't know, a month. Hello, there's one going around right now. What are you talking about? I'm talking about worms that are like 2003. They're still,
Hang on. In 2003, the summer of worms, computing didn't work, right? You went to a trade show in 2003, and all the computers were down. If you were a security guy, you were running around, not selling product. You were just fixing your competitors, because if you didn't, all of the people would leave the trade show. That was my summer of 2003. That sucked. Configure was not that.
You went to the wrong places.
I mean, seriously, we had a worm a month ago, but the level of systemic disruption that Configure caused is not even on the same order of magnitude, and that's a sign of success. We learned stuff.
I said that I was going to disagree with everything Dan said, but I actually agree with this.
So let me go back to some of Dan's points, just to provide a counterpoint now that you are agreeing with him. You mentioned something about finding it's better than I find a bug than some kid in Romania or Bulgaria or some other country. And
no offense to Romania or Bulgaria.
all right, yeah, but that's a false dichotomy. I mean, the chances that you find a bug and nobody else found it at the same time or before you are very slim. The chances of that happening repeatedly over time with several findings
Has been
are
proven.
infinitesimal, right? So you should assume that whatever you find, somebody else found it.
So format string vulnerabilities before around circa 2000 or so, that was infinitesimal because nobody was looking for them. They were there. They were there since the epoch
what are you
began,
talking about?
right?
Who was it? Was it Tesso? They said they had a Woo FTP debug, a format string for a decade before people were talking about format strings.
But what
which
was
year
the,
you said?
what
Before
is
which
the
year?
economic?
Before Newsham's format strings paper, I think there's some Woo FTP debug that I think Tesso or some group said, oh yeah, we've had this for 4 years, 4 or 5 years, and it's been present in Woo FTPD for a decade. They've known about it for a while, and they're like, oh, this is good. We're not telling anyone about
What
Is that a fair assumption? That,
what
that
i-
the
it-
bug you found, you have to assume someone else found it?
I would be shocked, given that all of DNS's security, as what it was from 99 on, was based on a technology that was. There are 15 ways around the TTL. I'm not the first person ever to have found that. What's key is this: it's what is the economic impact of some guy somewhere figuring it out and sitting on it. And the reality is there is no economic impact. There's very minimal economic impact for what's in the TESO archives, what's in the ADM archives. And if the reality is that they can come back and say, oh, we've known about that for a decade, that's nice. You didn't get it fixed. So, hey, everyone else, you did nothing to prevent someone else from being exposed to it.
But what if somebody's quietly exploiting it and you don't know about it?
There's always going to be quiet exploits. I mean, that's the reality of things. This bug was on a scale that there might have been 100 quiet exploiters, 1,000 quiet exploiters. I don't think I was the first person to find my DNS bug. I wanted to be the last, though. And that required getting it
DNS
fixed.
poisoning isn't all that quiet.
It can be real quiet. It can be incredibly quiet and subtle. That was the other fun thing, realizing how...
it can be incredibly quiet so as for you not to notice that somebody else is exploiting it, right?
Yeah, you go ahead and you poison like the domain that provides a static JavaScript file for some major website. So you're not actually poisoning Facebook directly, you're poisoning the domain for a 30-second period that happens to provide JavaScript. And now you're in the JavaScript DOM. I mean, there are ridiculously subtle attacks that could have been going on forever.
So therefore, you should assume that just because you cannot find an incident that you can point at, that doesn't mean that no incidents exist. And you should assume also that somebody else may have found the same bug and may be using it for other purposes than saving the planet.
But you know about bug dumping, right? I mean, like a patch comes out and it's like, well, my fully done exploit, this is the end of the line, so might as well go do a bunch of exploits as much as possible. Or, oh, that's the neat new thing, let's go ahead and write an exploit for it before the patches are applied, because I know in the real world, patches take time to apply. Look, I think we're having kind of a disclosure discussion in general, and I don't think anyone here argues that we should go back to the days, if they ever were there, where bugs weren't disclosed. Bugs should be disclosed with enough technical information so that independent engineers can reproduce the bugs. Otherwise, the potential for fraud is too high.
But
everyone agrees on that. The only question is, should there maybe be a little time for people to apply the patch? And
we don't actually know that. The thing is, right now, just to play devil's advocate, right now we live in an internet full of with cybercrime, with fraud, and with the current disclosure practices. We have not had an internet with fraud without a current disclosure practices, so we don't have any point of comparison. Basically, they evolved essentially in parallel, and the causation argument is impossible to know.
So where do we go from here as an industry? Just to bring the conversation back on top. Go ahead, Marcus.
I was going to say, if you're going to throw assumptions around, it's really interesting because you're actually engaging in a circular assumption. The assumption is that there's an infinity of bugs, and that if there's an infinity of bugs, they will continue to be found and continue to be disclosed, so you will have an infinity of fun. Okay? That's the problem. What needs to be done is not to say, let's figure out how to build a better bug finding and tracking economy, because the entire premise of the bug finding and tracking economy is that it's going to make software better. You look at the last 15 years of software evolution and the internet, and you can actually see it's getting worse. So if the premise is that what you're doing is helping, it's obviously refuted by a simple observation of the facts. We need a plan B, and your approach is not it.
Well, not exactly. There isn't actually an infinite source of bugs because people are writing more and more code. The number of bugs is proportional to the lines of code, and there's more code being written today than there was 5 years ago. Therefore, there will be more bugs.
And you're assuming two other things. One, that, and I think, Alex said this, but finding bugs is just fun. That's one of the things that you said. The second one is that software development and security has not improved in the past 15 years, and that's, I think, not a fact. In fact, I'm pretty sure that somebody on this table may have something to say about that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, certainly, our software has had measurable improvements even over the past 5 years. At Microsoft. And so I don't think it's fair to just, say that software as a whole hasn't improved. That's just not true of every single vendor.
I think it's more a reflection of how little we know, relatively speaking, right? Format strings, they're like 8 years old, something like that, right? Lots of software. Sorry. I think the fact that software is looking worse these days is because there's a much wider variety of vulnerabilities that we now know exist that we were not necessarily looking for 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And there is also the inexorable move towards additional software, the additional lines of code, these new technologies that sort of get created without any consideration for security. So in a sense, it is a lot worse, but with software that's been developed with, some notion of secure programming principles. If you just think in terms of the amount of human labor that it would take to break into a major vendor's software product, it's not going to be 5 minutes anymore in comparison with 10 years ago, 15 years ago.
Just to get it back on topic, where does the industry go from here in terms of getting around this notion of, okay, so trust is not a rational risk management approach. Peer review might be done. At the end of your thing, you were talking about maybe a council of peer review where, and again, the media has been left out of this entire discussion. A council of peer review to have the media report properly on security issues, because a lot of this stuff is driven by bad headlines or poor headlines, or the internet is dying headlines.
Is there a way to productionize trust? Sorry, I'm interrupting you. I'm over here. So to David's point before, like you said, where does the industry go from here? The key point everybody keeps batting around is this problem of trust. Like that seems to be what partial disclosure rests on, right? How do we this problem of trust and who do we trust? So is there a way to operationalize the concept of trust? Is there a way to develop like a standards body or a framework or some group whose job it is to say,
Right, exactly.
I listen to these guys and they seem like they know what they're talking about.
Some sort of.
So patch
We
management.
I did to answer Ryan's leading question. Yes, we do need basically some sort of peer review, because one of the things that happens with security researchers is every bug you find is your baby.
Yes.
It is the most serious bug that has ever happened, and it is completely blown out of proportion in your own mind. That's regardless. Any bug finder knows this.
And then you talk to the media, and that gets amplified
Unless
a
you're
little
marked
more.
out. Unless you're marked out, then you just don't care.
He's dulled to that sensation by now. I mean, when you're a cyborg from the future that can find a new bug and send mail in 2006.
He has to cut himself when he audits just to see if he can
Just
steal.
to feel something.
So I think to answer your question, I think that there are some things that can be done to make the trust a more viable approach.
But before that, Ivan, is there any scenario in your mind where partial disclosure is necessary and helpful?
It's necessary for what? I think everything that we do is partial. We don't provide all the details to the ultimate bit at the same time to everybody. Right. So there's a degree of disclosure that over time becomes more relaxed. The audience becomes wider and the level of details becomes more precise. However, I believe that to reinforce this idea of trust, what needs to happen is to have a transparent process, because you cannot achieve trust if you meet with 5 guys in a room to decide what you're going to do and nobody else knows what actually happened in that room and when that discussion took place and what was exactly the discussion, who said what, when.
So how do you
to make
get
the
around
whole
that?
process more transparent will help a lot towards building trust.
And transparent is what? Sharing that information with not 5 people, but 10? So what happens to the other 10? At some
So-
point, there's...
Transparent is sharing the information whoever needs or wants to look at it and may have a decision to make based on that.
So I want to get back to something that got said earlier about peer review and so on. Like, the biggest mistake I made when I came out with a DNS bug is that I didn't have any other hackers on board with me. That, when I was asked straight out 2 days later, hey dude, like, what's this bug you're talking to everyone about? I said to, someone respected in our community, no, I can't tell you. And caused all sorts of pain and, finally led into me getting Dino and should have had that on day 1. This is not a problem of who do you trust, because people trust their vendors. It's a problem of, it's a huge ask to ask people to violate their change control procedures. It's a huge ask to ask people, please patch your infrastructure with an emergency patch, even for 30 days. It's like we're telling people, please jump off a cliff. They're like, what? No. And they said, no, it's okay. There'll be water down there. People usually survive cliff diving. It's kind of a fun thing. It's enjoyable. It's cool. Gravity. And the IT admins are like, no. And, that was really the scenario I was looking at. It was like, I have this big, scary ask for people, and they're just going to reject it because the risk is so much higher. So I think framing the problem around, well, how do we get people to believe us that it's really important to apply the patch? It's the wrong way to think about it. It's how do we as an industry make the long-term changes so that infrastructure isn't so risky to patch? And this to some degree requires fundamental changes in hardware, requires the ability to integrate infrastructure into patch management, requires hardware that rolls back when a failed firmware image is installed, requires dealing with the fact that configuration files don't actually work from one version to another, maybe involves there not being 15,000 versions. So, I mean, these are engineering problems. We keep blaming the business guys and saying it's business realities. We're just not being very good engineers here. That's the bottom line.
I think we can all agree that disclosure could be better than it currently is, that there are still things that we haven't sorted out about what's the best way to disclose vulnerabilities. And I think maybe we might be able to take a lesson from some other form of disclosure that's maybe been around longer that seems to work better. Let's go back to the idea of automobiles. Recalls. People are very motivated to take advantage of recall programs. Is there anything that we could possibly learn from that? Is there, some way that some positive reinforcement that we can use to motivate people to patch rather than a negative reinforcement?
Well, people are very willing to do recalls because people die if you don't do recalls. You have all these pictures of like cars exploding,
But
and
people
you don't want
lose
this to happen
jobs
to
over
you.
vulnerabilities.
What?
People don't always die over recalls. Sometimes they just get burned, and sometimes people lose their job. Well, what I'm saying is that people sometimes lose their jobs over vulnerabilities. So why isn't there the same response? And can we take anything from that?
I don't think people lose their jobs over vulnerabilities enough for that to work. Like if I'm a sysadmin and the server gets popped with an exploit, I'm probably not going to get fired because exploits happen to everybody.
Let's not forget that we didn't always take the people dying in cars seriously either. Even back and forth, when the cars were blowing up, they actually did an ROI and said, it'll cost less to pay for the insurance than it will to pay for the ladders to put in the cars and make them not explode. So I think we're dealing with some of that here too.
To a degree, I mean, people dying is special. Like, people dying is special from the perspective of, for 5,000 years, when one guy dies, the rest of the family goes up to the person who's responsible for it and beats the crap out of them. I mean, this is a human thing that happens. I mean, you can even see it in animals. There really do seem to be two kinds of human creativity. You have people die, so that's anything manufactured has product liability attached to it because people die. This cup can kill me, this thing can kill me, this iPhone can kill me. And so there's product liability attached to it. And then there's the Hollywood buddy movie, which might be terrible, might be awful, might waste 2 hours of my life, but it's not gonna kill me. And so there's no product liability attached to it. Software actually lives in the scale of Hollywood movies. It may be good, it may be terrible, but you're probably not gonna die. There are a few exceptions, but the reality is more people have been killed by Windows crashing on them than by Windows crashing.
So, Dan,
So
clearly Windows
we
needs
have
better
this
engineering.
situation. Let me finish this out. So we have this situation where there's no product liability attached because the consequences of failure don't involve dead bodies. There's a minimal corpse count here. And the issue is that it is really computing is the first realm where you don't have dead bodies, but you do have widespread economic damage. And so this new third category in the middle, we don't know how to deal with it. We know we probably don't want to do product liability though, because there are database products that'll go unnamed that I'm not sure what decade they could ship in if we had product liability for security vulnerabilities. It wouldn't be this one. It wouldn't be the next one either. It'd be 2023, you can have your financial database back up. So, that's the reality of things. We've been very productive and innovative without a product liability regime. If we were to insert one, it would get messy. And so the best we have to deal with now are security researchers providing some kind of information to the market these are the solutions that are secure, and these are the solutions that'll blow up in your face.
So,
I completely agree, Dan, that we need to have better engineering, both in terms of like the software development as well as the deployment of our infrastructure. But as much as I hate to say it, we're an industry, IT, that is perhaps one of the most egotistical industries on the planet. And security
You don't
people-
know any surgeons, do you?
I said one of.
Okay, thank you.
The medical industry is another. And within that industry, much like surgeons within the medical industry, security people are some of the biggest asshats around, myself included. And if we want to have trust with the business to convince them we know what's right, we occasionally have to admit that we don't know what's going on and that we don't know the right answer.
Yeah.
And as opposed to going, the correct answer is to ban this or to do this right now, because the fact is we don't know.
But there's a problem, a similar problem to that is what I call going native. When the security person identifies too much with the IT teams, like what's painful for them, they go native and they're too compassionate and they're like, well, you're right, this isn't too much of an issue. I know you enjoy your weekend. Nothing will happen, and then something does, and it's on them too. I mean, you have to maintain some level of independence so that while you're not completely on the side of being a total asshat that no one wants to work with, but you actually can reliably and accurately portray the risk of an issue.
So while there is always that risk of going native, I suppose, I think it is valuable to have sort of cross-group professionals in our industry, people who have been responsible for large infrastructure deployments, and people who and that availability, maintaining that availability, and perhaps their bonus structure was tied to how many hours of uptime their infrastructure had, to give them a real incentive. And they also, should be security people who overlap with those types of people. So, I mean, you could say that it dilutes one or the other, but I would actually say that it probably will strengthen the position of both sides to have more of those cross-group people.
Mm-hmm. So,
Jack.
The security professionals that are trying to fix things, the researchers, we're talking about the business people, and I'd kind of like to come back to the other person at the dance, which is the vendor's reaction to bug disclosure in the past has kind of gotten us where we are, where there are people who have reported things. Some companies are getting better, some are getting worse. There's the ego issue of my bug is the worst in the world, but there's a party. I've got a long history in the automotive industry, and there were no seat belts until people died and somebody made them, and some manufacturers like Volvo then realized, I'm going to make a safe car, and it's a selling point. And so the other person at the dance here is the vendor and how they've reacted. And there are various people that are in this room that have gone through things and know. So we kind of have to address how the vendors respond to this. And I don't want to put Katie on the spot because of where she is. No, I don't, because actually as much as fun as it is to make fun of Microsoft, everybody here has to do the Microsoft bit, right? Microsoft sucks, it's so insecure, they've gotten so much better and they're so much better than everybody else, under our breath, but
A little louder, please, I need it for my ringtone.
Well. That's as loud as it gets. But you know what I mean, because you live this, but I just want to bring it back to the vendors. If the vendors hadn't gotten us to this point where NHTSA had to say, put a seat belt in there, we wouldn't be there. And so some vendors, and they all react differently, so it's not an easy answer either. That doesn't give us an answer. But I just wanted to point out that there's somebody else at the party.
Right, the vendors have a role in this whole partial disclosure debate as well. How much information are they willing to share during an attack, what kind of mitigation they can offer ahead of a patch, and what kind of information they share back and forth with bug finders and all that stuff. There's another group in this party, I totally agree. But where do we go from here? How do we fix this information? What level of information needs to be shared?
Let me just ask a question, that one. What do you guys think on the panel of the SourceFire VRT team putting information out about the Adobe security issue? We know that the number of trusted groups, define whatever a trusted group is, has been working on it for like 2 months trying to fix it. And then Adobe, the SourceFire guys actually come up with a patch with enough details to give the gadbys even more of a chance to come up with kits to exploit it. What's your view on that? Is that moving back 5-10 years, or is that partial disclosure, is that okay or not, you know? And, you know, if you look at it from a trust point of view, was Sourcefire not part of the right trust group, you know, to be in the loop?
I think Adobe taking 2 months, maybe more, to patch this vulnerability when it was known that it was actually in the wild and the bad guys were actively using it. I think this is moving back 5 years. You know, in 2009, you should have a better reaction time than multiple months on a public 0 day.
Not so much the
I
patching,
think-
but even to offer some sort of guidance.
I disagree. I think that is 2009, not just Adobe, but every other vendor does exactly the same, and with a few specific cases in which that doesn't happen. But the norm
It's 2 months.
It's
the
at least 2
MSRC talk
months.
yesterday was, yeah, there's a 2 months test process that goes into every patch.
at least in 2 months, and that is if they get it right in the first shot. If
Yeah,
not,
but-
there's another 2 months to wait for it, and usually it's 6 months. So, and that's the norm.
that's not for 0 days. I mean, certainly we've seen Microsoft react more quickly than that.
In some cases.
At extraordinary expense. I mean, there is a exponential cost to putting out a fix to an O-day. I mean, fixing bugs is a little harder than opening up a hex editor and changing a few bytes around. Like, you can do that, and it'll maybe work for one little variant of the attack, but the reality is that engineering quality, I mean, people want things that work. People want Acrobat to work. And one of the funniest things I remembered hearing after the Acrobat vuln was, well, why does Acrobat need to have JavaScript anyway? You know, it's like, you know, I'll run no script on a website. Why does the web need JavaScript anyway? Well, because that's functionality that people need in order to get their jobs done. It's not security for security's sake. Security is necessary, but it's not the point.
Actually, you're wrong about the hex editor thing, but we can talk about this later.
You know what?
The-
Raise your hand if you want to have patches that are comprehensive, well tested, and do not impact functionality. Versus, who knows what it does? We modified it in a hex editor.
Why are all your options binary? Either the software is secure or it blows in your face. Either you have patches that are completely tested, reliable, or you have nothing. The real world is analog, not binary.
Things are more quantized than you think. Either you tested it enough or you didn't.
So the problem goes back to like, so how we set up our infrastructure. For instance, okay, we know that there are vulnerabilities in software. We know that a number of these vulnerabilities are exploitable. We know a number of these vulnerabilities will be exploited. And yet, still, one client-side bug ruins our day. I mean, doesn't that kind of point to the larger problem? That basically we are really getting in a tizzy because someone can send you like a PDF and all of a sudden all the sensitive information in your organization is leaking out to who knows who?
The fragility
because of
our
one
systems.
vulnerability?
Yes.
That's, I mean, that's the thing that we need to, that's the hard plumbing to actually rewire, is that we assume that, you know, everyone needs to have access to the most sensitive documents in the organization on the same computer that they, you know, surf the web with and answer their email and do all this other things. Like, no other, except for in like, you know, information technology, no one else does this. Banks have vaults. They put all their important things, you know, they limit access to it, and they put people far behind. Like, the way that we still build our networks allows, you know, you should, to compromise an organization's like, you know, deepest secrets, you should have to use at least 6 vulnerabilities, not just one.
And banks don't usually tell you that, oh, securing your money is really hard and we have all these difficulties, so therefore, well, we're going to see if in 6 months we're going to put a vault, right? So that's, and I usually don't like analogies, but going back to Dan's comment on the complexity of testing patches and deploying or shipping patches, yes, that's actually a real problem. But I didn't pick the engineering process that my vendors are using. I already financed that engineering process, and if they pick an engineering process that makes them that makes it really hard to fix their own bugs, then why should I pay again for fixing it?
You know, it's an absolutely great point that if you want to have security as something that you deliver, it needs to be a first-class citizen in your development model. And really, until about 2003, I don't think the rest of computing, outside of us guys who like breaking stuff, I don't think the rest of computing got that if they were going to do what we wanted, they were going to have to change their processes. I mean, it's not the performance development life cycle, it's not the reliability development life cycle, it's the secure development life cycle. And that level of, wow, we can do everything right, we can get all of our features in, we can have perfect performance, and still, when we ship it, customers are going to scream and shout, oh my God, it's missing this check. And I want this feature in here, not in your next version, not in your next service pack, not next week. I want to fix now. I mean, this is new. From an engineering perspective, demanding fixes on rapidly accelerated timelines is something that is difficult, not impossible, but something that does require investment and process in order to establish. Figuring out how to develop and modify and evolve development practices so that bugs can be fixed on a reasonable time scale when it comes in responsibly, so that it can be fixed on an unreasonable time scale when it's dropped by a kid in Romania. I mean, these are hard problems, but we should recognize them as engineering challenges.
Okay, the vendor would like to speak here about the difficulties of issuing vendor updates. So there was actually a great talk yesterday morning by some of my compatriots in the audience, here from the MSRC ops and engineering teams.
I strongly recommend you get those slides and watch that talk when it's available on video.
Watch the talk.
It's a real good look into what Microsoft does.
Again, I would like a chance here. So, so the thing is, the way that I look at it and the way that I've looked at it from before, I worked at my current employer is, as a security person, what are we doing? We're finding vulnerabilities, we're breaking stuff, right? So when we report them to a vendor, we'd like them to fix the broken stuff. If in that process of issuing a fix for the broken stuff, they break more stuff, that's not really serving the purpose, right? So, I mean, that's really the core of the matter. There has to be some quality assurance processes. That does happen to take time. The bigger the footprint of your deployed, vendor footprint, the longer it's going to take. The more app compat testing you have to do, the longer it's going to take. The breadth of your products, the depth of your products, that's all determining factors. So it's not, it's not that you don't have an engineering process that is so bloated that you can't fix things quickly. It's that you have a breadth and depth of products, and you have a responsibility to your customers to not introduce worse scenarios for them by issuing your update before you properly tested it.
So, but yes, it's not that you have a software engineering process that cannot fix things quickly. You have an engineering process that can fix things within 2 months. And some other vendors can fix things within 4 months or per quarter, and some others within a week, right? Some vendors issue fixes for the specific bug that was reported to them. Some vendors cluster hundreds of fixes on the same patch and then need to test the entire patch on the entire platforms that they support. The choice of which vendor does what and which engineering processes are followed are not made by the customers. They are made by the vendor. And the customer pays for that choice.
I disagree 100%. As the customer, the vendors do what I demand, because I demand it, and this person demands it, and this person demands it, and that's why Oracle does more security. It's why Microsoft does more security, because we said we're not buying that shit. And it turns out that Oracle customers wanted their patches quarterly. Microsoft want them monthly. It used to be that Microsoft patches came out weekly, and too many people said that's too much. And getting back to trust, I happily deploy Microsoft patches within hours of them showing up, because Microsoft has established that I can trust them that they're going to work. Every single time. They're going to work. And when I did this, with tens of thousands of machines every month at my last job, because I knew I was willing to take the risk that there was an off chance it might break something, and I would rather break something in the way that I understood it than waiting for the next big bug, the next big worm or whatever to come out. But the fact of the matter is, if I knew that Microsoft was pushing them out after 8 hours of testing as opposed to a couple of days of testing or whatever it was, I wouldn't trust them as much and I would wait longer and I would do more testing on my side. So if you want us to trust you as researchers and as vendors, I would much rather wait an extra couple of weeks and know it was right the first time.
But would you make that decision on behalf of every other customer like you?
We
That's
do it
the
as
issue.
we as an industry, as customers, have made that demand. We have said, make the patches right or we'll go somewhere else. I will
Right.
spend money with your competitor because your patches suck.
But would you like me to make that decision for you or for somebody else in the audience?
As a security researcher, no. That's why I went to Microsoft and said,
As a
fix
software
it,
vendor,
or I
yes.
will go to someone else.
As a security researcher
It
or
sounds like he
practitioner,
wants it
no,
his way
but
and not
as
yours.
a software vendor, yes.
Yes. What
That's
I'm
the other,
telling you
right.
is, as the person spending the money, I have gone to my vendors and said, this is what I want, and you will make it so, or I will find someone else to give my money to.
Right, and that's a financial incentive.
It's the only incentive there is.
But Ivan's point is right. I mean, the only way you make proper decisions is based on information, based on good, hard, quantifiable metrics, numbers, information. And the only way to measure real risk, again, coming back to the whole partial disclosure thing, is how much information is enough. Is partial enough? And we got to wrap up. I think Katie's got a flight. And the camera, the recording has run out already. So just go down, up and down the table. Dan, what's a perfect world, disclosure-wise?
Wow.
No, I have a plane to catch. What do you?
I'm asking everyone, what is a perfect world in your mind? And are we ever going to get there?
We have two problems driving the industry right now, I think. Two real core issues. One of the problems is we don't know how to get authentication working between nodes. That we might have some ways of fixing. The other one is we don't really know how to write secure code, and when we screw up, we don't really know how to fix it unless we do, the Windows update approach. How we fix those two problems, I don't think is a, shake our fists at the business guys problem. Perfect world is a lot more investment in operational infrastructure, in patching infrastructure, in development life cycles, in just really getting part of the conversation being, yeah, this is a feature that actually matters. And by the way, there are ways that people are going to measure you and potentially direct their money in one way versus another based on how security is done. Not just how performance is, not just how reliability is, but also how security is, and have that be on real world actual metrics as opposed to what got in the press the other day. I think that's the perfect world.
Alex.
All right, so in my perfect world, vulnerabilities, actually this happens in this world too. Usually there is a curve, and vendors and customers are at the point of the curve that corresponds to the now time. Attacks and potential attacks are in the future. If you only do your risk analysis based on the attacks that are currently being exploited and the vulnerabilities that are currently known, that people currently know how to exploit, then you might do fine for today, 2009. But if you don't think about what are the attacks going to be in 10 years and start working on remedying these attacks, because the remedy might take 10 years. Redoing your entire engineering or software development process might take quite a long time. So if you start doing this when the attacks are actually a fact, this means that your customers are going to be exposed to it for a number of years until you have the capacity to deal with them. So I wish people did risk analysis by paying more attention to what is coming in the future, using the current attacks just as a guide for what could be possible, but multiply them by a factor of 10. In that perfect world, we might have actual security, but I don't think this will happen.
Katie disagrees.
Wow, that's such a sunny view of the perfect world. So you know, obviously we're in a place where you know, engineering practices are being refined across the board. At Microsoft and at other vendors, we have a secure development lifecycle that we use to help us build more secure software from the ground up. Perhaps what we need, you know, to extend this to infrastructure and deployment organizations is something more along the lines of a secure development and deployment lifecycle, or bring the D all the way up to a full double D. Perhaps, you know, it's a little bit difficult to convey, you know, what an ideal world would look like, because honestly, you know, we're still at odds, you know, as an industry. The people who find vulnerabilities and the people who are responsible for maintaining systems, you know, are still not seeing eye to eye. And I would like to see, you know, a lot more overlap, a lot more collaboration, and yeah, a lot more trust building between the people who say the sky is falling and the people, you know, to whom the sky will fall upon. So that would be my, you know, sort of ideal world.
Is there an ideal world, Dino?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ironically, it's taken me a decade, but I've finally come to agree with Marcus Ranu, who has now left.
I thought you waited for him to leave to say this.
No, like basically the penetrate and patch cycle, I'm starting to believe is kind of a distraction. That basically the fact that, so if someone were to just post a really, you know, serious IEO day, full exploit, weaponized, 100% reliable to the net right now. In the ideal world, that really wouldn't matter very much, because we'd have enough exploit mitigations, we have, you know, segmented networks and enough other barriers that would make that not be as serious as it is today. You know, someone saying, I found a bigger rock with which I can throw through thicker windows, that wouldn't be a big deal. And that's what I consider the ideal world, where we have more more defense systems that actually work, and more intelligence on how to build networks that one O day does not ruin your day.
But it's an arms race. I mean, Mark Dowd is going to get up at Black Hat and cut through all those defenses. And
Yeah, because Mark Dowd, but it should take Mark Dowd 10 bugs to compromise my organization, not one.
Ivan gets the last word.
Oh, sorry, and diversity. He should have 10 bugs in 10 different products of 10 different technology sets to compromise my organization, not just one.
So I don't think there is a perfect world. So it's a bit naive to think about the perfect world in security. I think there isn't going to be a perfect world ever. We need to grow up and assume that we will deal with imperfect software and hardware, and we will deal with security that it's not complete. I also think that it's easy to go, and I disagree with Dino agreeing with Marcus. It's easy to give up and say, oh, penetrate and patch doesn't work. We should look for a revolutionary change that will make all things great, and we'll write the software right from the start. That's not going to happen. Security will improve, from my perspective, on more like an evolutionary manner, and we will get incrementally better over time. It's gonna, how much it costs and how fast it's gonna be depends on how we deal with the problems that we find. I think that in order to make that faster, the pace faster, and to reduce the cost, we need to provide more information, more technical details, provide them in a transparent manner, and help people make decisions by themselves and not have the arrogance of making decisions for everybody else. Lastly, I also think that we also tend to think that researchers, vendors, customers, security practitioners, they are like separate groups, and in fact they're not. They're always in the same mix. We do research, we also build software, and we are also customers of several vendors. And I think we're not unique in that aspect.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you, Dino. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Dan. Thanks to everyone. It was
Thank you.